Welcome, my friends. Tonight, you and I will embark on a journey through the darkest corridors of human imagination, where justice wore the mask of theater and punishment became performance art. We'll walk through the blood-soaked arenas of ancient Rome, traverse the endless prairies of the American frontier, and listen to the first melodies that made us human. Before we begin, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Are you settling in for a quiet evening in London, starting your day with coffee in Sydney, taking a study break in New York? I love knowing that we're all here together, scattered across the globe, but united by our curiosity about the human story. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now, because this journey is going to be unforgettable. Tonight, we're not just learning history, we're experiencing the full spectrum of human nature, from its most creative heights to its most disturbing depths. So dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. We begin in ancient Rome, not to witness its legendary triumphs or political machinations, but to explore something far darker and stranger. While Rome gave us roads that still carry traffic today, aqueducts that still inspire engineers, and legal systems that form the backbone of modern justice, it also gave us some of the most absurd, theatrical, and downright disturbing punishments the ancient world ever conceived. You see, my friends, the Romans didn't just execute criminals, they put on a show. Every punishment was carefully crafted to send a message, to entertain the masses, and to demonstrate the absolute power of the state. They turned human suffering into spectacle, and they did it with a creativity that would make Hollywood directors blush. Tonight, we'll meet the Vestal Virgins who were buried alive for breaking their vows of chastity, their screams muffled by earth and stone. We'll witness the macabre poetry of the Pona Kulei, where patricides were sewn into leather sacks with animals and thrown into rivers. We'll stand beneath the Tarpeian Rock, where traitors took their final flight into oblivion. But Rome's genius, if we can call it that, lay not just in the brutality of these punishments, but in their psychological precision. Every method was designed to exploit a specific fear, to create a lasting impression on witnesses, to ensure that the memory of punishment would outlive the victim by decades. Consider the Vestal Virgins, those spiritual guardians of Rome's eternal flame. These women were handpicked before puberty to serve the goddess Vesta for 30 years, maintaining their virginity as a sacred duty. They were the spiritual equivalent of a city's power grid. If they went down, everything went wrong. But what happened when one of these holy women broke her vow? The Romans faced a theological problem. They couldn't spill the blood of a Vestal, as it would offend the gods. So they found a delightful loophole that would make any lawyer proud. They buried her alive. Picture this macabre scene. A pit is dug, carefully measured and prepared. The condemned Vestal is lowered into this earthen tomb with a flickering oil lamp, a small loaf of bread, and a pitcher of water. Because, hey, even in execution, Rome maintains certain standards of hospitality. Then the pit is sealed, the earth is packed down, and Rome dusts off its hands and moves on. The poor woman would lie there in the suffocating darkness, thinking about her life choices, while Rome celebrated its clever solution to a divine dilemma. No blood spilled, no gods offended, problem solved. The men she was caught with, they were simply whipped to death in public. Brutal, yes, but refreshingly straightforward compared to the theological gymnastics required for the Vestal's punishment. This attention to detail, this commitment to finding creative solutions to moral and legal problems defined Roman justice. They weren't just killing people, they were making statements about power, morality, and the consequences of challenging the established order. And this was just the beginning. Rome's catalogue of punishments reads like a fever dream written by someone with too much imagination and not nearly enough compassion. Each method tells us something about Roman values, fears, and obsessions. They reveal a civilization that was simultaneously sophisticated and savage, brilliant and brutal. As we explore these punishments tonight, remember that we're not just learning about ancient history, we're examining the human capacity for both creativity and cruelty, the thin line between justice and vengeance, and the ways that societies use violence to maintain order and project power. So buckle up, my friends. We're about to descend into the darkest corners of the Roman imagination, where death was never simple and justice always came with a side of spectacle.
Let me paint you a picture of Rome at its most hypocritical. Here was a civilization that prided itself on law, order, and divine favor. Yet when it came to punishing those who served their gods most faithfully, they became masters of bureaucratic sadism. The Vestal Virgins occupied a unique position in Roman society. These weren't ordinary priestesses. They were living symbols of Rome's purity and divine protection. Selected between the ages of 6 and 10, these girls were taken from their families and inducted into a life of sacred service that would last 3 decades. For the first 10 years, they learned their duties. For the next 10, they performed them. For the final 10, they taught newcomers. Only then, at around 40 years old, were they free to marry and live ordinary lives. But here's what made their positions so precarious. Their virginity wasn't just a personal choice, it was a matter of national security. Romans genuinely believed that if a Vestal Virgin broke her vow of chastity, the gods would withdraw their protection from Rome. Crops would fail, enemies would invade, the very foundations of the empire would crumble. So when Cornelia, a Vestal Virgin during Emperor Domitian's reign, was accused of unchastity, it wasn't just a personal scandal, it was a national crisis. Before her execution, she reportedly shouted her defiance, "Does Caesar think I've had sex with a god then? Because no mortal man has touched me." It was a bold move, appealing to the very superstitions that condemned her. After all, if she had been intimate with a deity, surely that was beyond mortal jurisdiction. But logic and desperation rarely triumph over political necessity. Cornelia was buried alive, and Rome slept soundly, convinced that divine order had been restored. Now, if you think being sewn into a sack with angry animals sounds like the plot of a particularly disturbing horror movie, you're not wrong. But this was ponacule, the penalty of the sack, and it was Rome's special punishment for patricide, the killing of one's father. The Romans took family bonds seriously, perhaps because their entire social structure depended on paternal authority. A father in Rome had the power of life and death over his children, could sell them into slavery, and controlled every aspect of their lives until his death. So when someone killed their father, they weren't just committing murder. They were attacking the very foundation of Roman society. The ritual was elaborate and symbolic. First, the condemned would be blindfolded and have their hands tied, perhaps to give them a moment to reflect on their choices, though by this point reflection was somewhat academic. Then they would be sewn into a large leather sack, but they wouldn't be alone in their final journey. Joining them were 4 carefully selected animals: a dog, representing the loyalty the condemned had lacked; a monkey, perhaps symbolizing the chaos and unpredictability they had brought into the world; a snake, representing deceit and the serpentine nature of their crime; and a rooster, possibly chosen for its vigilance, the quality that should have prevented such a heinous act. Can you imagine the moment inside that sack? You're being headbutted by a panicked monkey while a snake coils around your leg. The dog is barking frantically, and the rooster, convinced it's morning in the middle of this nightmare, is doing what roosters do best. If this sounds like the worst escape room ever conceived, that's essentially what it was, except the only escape was death. The symbolism was deliberately overwhelming. Each animal represented something the condemned had violated or abandoned. The sack represented the womb they had betrayed by killing the man who gave them life. The water represented purification, not for the condemned, but for society, washing away the stain of their crime. What's particularly chilling about this punishment is its rarity. This wasn't something Romans did casually. It was reserved for the most unthinkable of crimes, used just enough often to maintain its psychological power. Most people never witnessed a ponokule, but everyone knew about it. It lived in whispers and warnings, a deterrent that worked precisely because it was so bizarrely horrific. The punishment also reveals Rome's talent for psychological warfare. They didn't just want to kill the condemned, they wanted to create a spectacle so memorable, so disturbing, that it would haunt the imagination of potential criminals for generations. It was deterrence through theater, justice through terror. But perhaps most significantly, both the burial of Vestal virgins and the ponokule show us Rome's obsession with symbolic purity. These weren't practical punishments designed for efficiency. They were elaborate rituals designed to restore cosmic order. Rome saw itself as divinely favored, and these punishments were their way of demonstrating to both gods and mortals that certain boundaries could never be crossed without consequences that transcended ordinary human suffering. In Rome, justice wasn't blind. It was an artist with a particularly dark imagination.
When most people hear the word crucifixion, they think of a single, tragic figure on a wooden cross. But leave it to the Romans to take even this most solemn form of execution and add their own theatrical flourishes. Because in Rome, if something was worth doing brutally, it was worth doing creatively. The inverted crucifixion represents perhaps the most psychologically complex variation of this already horrific punishment. While standard crucifixion was designed to maximize both physical suffering and public humiliation, flipping the victim upside down changed the entire dynamic of the ordeal. Consider the case of St. Peter, one of Jesus' 12 apostles, who, according to Christian tradition, was crucified upside down during Emperor Nero's persecution of Christians. But here's what makes Peter's story so fascinating. He apparently requested this variation himself. When sentenced to die by crucifixion, Peter reportedly said, "I am not worthy to die as my Lord died." He asked to be crucified upside down. Now Rome, being the efficient administrative machine that it was, simply shrugged and said, sure, why not? They weren't particularly invested in the symbolic meaning of the request. They were just happy to accommodate a prisoner who was making their job interesting. But from a medical standpoint, inverted crucifixion was even more brutal than the standard method. Blood rushed to the head, creating crushing pressure behind the eyes and in the skull. The unnatural positioning of limbs created different stress patterns on joints and muscles. Breathing became nearly impossible as the diaphragm worked against gravity. If regular crucifixion was like drowning in air, inverted crucifixion was like drowning while standing on your head. The Romans understood that the physical differences weren't just academic, they were psychological. An upside-down cross created a more disturbing visual for spectators, an image that would linger in memory long after the victim's suffering ended. It was crucifixion as surreal art, death as performance piece. What's particularly ironic is how this symbol was later reclaimed and reinterpreted. Peter's inverted cross, originally a symbol of humility and unworthiness, eventually became associated with anti-Christian sentiment in popular culture. Horror movies and heavy metal album covers turned Peter's symbol of reverence into an icon of rebellion. It's a perfect example of how symbols can be completely transformed by the cultures that inherit them. But if you want to see Roman military discipline at its most terrifying, look no further than decimation. This wasn't just a punishment, it was a masterclass in psychological warfare that made Game of Thrones look like a children's bedtime story. Here's how decimation worked. When a Roman military unit showed cowardice in battle, attempted desertion, or engaged in mutiny, their commander had a nuclear option available. The entire unit would be lined up and lots would be drawn, not for who would die, for who would live. Every 10th soldier, the word decimation comes from the Latin decimare, meaning to remove a 10th, would be beaten to death by their 9 comrades. Think about the psychological brutality of this system. Not only did you face the possibility of death, but if you survived, you had to participate in killing someone you'd probably shared meals with, fought beside, and trusted with your life.
It was like a twisted team-building exercise designed by someone with a profound understanding of human psychology and absolutely no compassion. The weapons for these executions weren't provided. Soldiers had to use whatever was at hand: clubs, stones, boots, fists. It was deliberately crude and personal. No clean sword strokes, no distance between killer and victim, just brutal, intimate violence administered by friends and brothers in arms. And the psychological aftermath, the 9 survivors weren't given time off to process what they'd done. Instead, they were punished as a group, fed barley instead of wheat, a mark of shame in the Roman military, and forced to camp outside the security of the fort's walls. The message was clear. You failed as a unit. You killed as a unit. Now you'll suffer as a unit. The most famous use of decimation was by Marcus Licinius Crassus during the Spartacus slave revolt. After his forces suffered a humiliating defeat, Crassus decided to restore discipline through decimation. Because apparently, nothing says, "We're back on track," like forcing your surviving soldiers to murder their comrades with clubs. But here's what made decimation so effective. It created a fear that was stronger than the fear of enemy soldiers. If you knew that cowardice or disobedience could result in your best friend being forced to beat you to death with a club, you might think twice about breaking ranks. The Roman military became legendary for its discipline, and decimation was one of the psychological tools that forged that reputation. It was brilliant, brutal, and absolutely terrifying. Roman commanders understood that controlling an army meant controlling not just individual soldiers, but the relationships between them. Decimation weaponized friendship, turned loyalty into a form of torture, and made every soldier complicit in the system that oppressed them. In Rome, even military discipline was a form of theater, played out on a stage built from human bones and watered with tears.
As Rome evolved from republic to empire, and particularly as Christianity began to challenge traditional beliefs, the Romans developed increasingly sophisticated methods of dealing with what they considered ideological threats. The fork of heretics represents this evolution, a punishment that was as much about controlling thought as controlling behavior. Imagine being fitted with a device that sounds almost comically medieval, but was brutally effective. A metal rod with 2 prongs at each end. One end was positioned under your chin, pointing upward toward your jaw. The other end was pressed against your chest, pointing toward your heart. This wasn't designed to kill you quickly. It was designed to make you wish you were dead. The genius of this device lay in its simplicity and its psychological impact. Once strapped on, you were forbidden to move your head in any direction. Look down, the upper prongs would pierce your throat. Look up or to either side, the lower prongs would puncture your chest. Try to whisper a heretical thought to someone nearby, stabbed by your own collar. What made this particularly insidious was that it didn't draw blood immediately. The fork was precisely calibrated to cause maximum discomfort without immediate death. You'd be left standing, sometimes for days, straining every muscle in your neck and upper body just to avoid slowly impaling yourself on your own punishment device. The psychological warfare was exquisite. This wasn't just about silencing heretics, it was about making silence itself a form of torture. Every breath became a calculated risk. Every swallow was an exercise in precise muscular control. The body became both prison and executioner, punishing thought crimes through enforced stillness. To make the torture even more theatrical, these forks sometimes bore Latin inscriptions like "Abjuro," I renounce, or "I confess my guilt," because nothing reinforces a forced confession quite like being slowly impaled by typography. The victim was literally wearing their punishment, transformed into a walking advertisement for orthodox thinking. What's particularly chilling about the heretic's fork is how it represented Rome's evolution in understanding psychological control. Early Roman punishments were often swift and public: crucifixions, arena deaths, executions for the crowd. But the fork was private,
prolonged and intensely personal. It was torture that worked on the mind as much as the body. Now, if the fork of heretics was Rome's way of dealing with dangerous thoughts, the Tarpeian rock was their method for handling dangerous actions. This wasn't subtle psychological warfare. This was gravity as executioner, with all the dramatic flair that Roman justice demanded. The rock itself was an 80-foot cliff on the southern face of the Capitoline Hill, conveniently located just a short walk from the Roman Forum. It wasn't chosen randomly. This location was deliberate, visible, and symbolic. Traitors weren't just killed, they were literally thrown out of the city, cast down from the very hill that housed Rome's most sacred temples. The rock got its name from Tarpeia, a Roman girl whose story has become legendary. According to the myth, she betrayed Rome to the attacking Sabines in exchange for what they wore on their sword arms. She was thinking of their golden bracelets. The Sabines, being literal-minded sorts, technically fulfilled their bargain by crushing her with their shields, which they also wore on their sword arms. Her body was then tossed from the cliff, giving the rock its name and establishing its reputation as a place where betrayal met its inevitable end. But Tarpeia's story is more than just the origin of the rock's name. It's a perfect allegory for Roman attitudes toward treason. The girl was punished not just for her betrayal, but for her greed and her naivety. She thought she was making a clever bargain, but she failed to understand that enemies who would use a traitor would never trust one. After that foundational betrayal, the Tarpeian rock became Rome's favorite solution for dealing with traitors, corrupt officials, false witnesses, and anyone else who made the state collectively say, "Yeah, this one needs to go," dramatically. The process was deliberately theatrical. The condemned were often stripped, paraded through the streets, and marched to the edge where crowds would gather to watch gravity handle the sentencing. It was public execution as civic entertainment, with the added symbolism of physical removal from the city itself. What made the Tarpeian rock particularly effective was its location. Positioned just a stone's throw from the Temple of Jupiter, it meant that condemned traitors spent their final moments with a perfect view of the divine authority they had betrayed. It was irony carved in stone and measured in vertical feet. The rock represented Roman justice at its most elemental, swift, final, and absolutely unforgiving. There was no appeal process, no lengthy deliberation, no complex theological considerations. Just a short walk, a brief flight, and a permanent solution to the problem with betrayal. In Rome, if you were going to throw someone under the bus, you did it literally, except instead of a bus, it was an 80-foot drop onto jagged rocks, and instead of under, it was over. It was elegant in its simplicity, brutal in its finality, and Roman in its theatrical presentation.
Welcome to the Colosseum, where 50,000 roaring fans gathered to witness what the Romans euphemistically called justice, but what we might more accurately describe as dinner theater with a very high mortality rate. The arena wasn't just Rome's premier entertainment venue, it was a carefully orchestrated machine for transforming human tragedy into public spectacle. Damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts, represented Roman showmanship at its most grotesque. This wasn't simply a matter of throwing criminals to wild animals and walking away. Oh no, that would be far too simple for Roman tastes. They turned these executions into elaborate morality plays, complete with costumes, sets, and storylines that would make Broadway producers weep with envy. Picture this scene. A condemned criminal is led into the arena, but he's not dressed in simple prison garb. Instead, he's been costumed as Orpheus, the legendary musician whose songs could charm wild beasts. The crowd settles in, perhaps expecting to see this mythological reenactment play out as a story of triumph over savage nature. Then the gates open, and hungry lions pour in,
The performance becomes a grotesque parody as the man attempts to sing while being mauled, his lyre forgotten as survival instinct takes over. Another victim might be dressed as Prometheus, chained to a rock, while trained eagles or vultures were released to peck at him, recreating the eternal punishment of the Titan who stole fire from the gods. It was entertainment, religious instruction, and state propaganda, all rolled into one fur-covered nightmare. The Romans spared no expense in these productions. If the lions seemed sluggish or uncooperative, they had methods to encourage more dramatic performances. Animals might be starved for days beforehand, or prodded with hot irons just before release. After all, the show must go on, and disappointed spectators were bad for the empire's reputation. What made damnatio ad bestias particularly cruel was its democratic nature. You didn't have to be a hardened criminal to end up in the arena. Theft, political dissent, or simply being a Christian who refused to acknowledge Roman gods could earn you a starring role in these deadly pageants. The arena consumed slaves, prisoners of war, political prisoners, and religious martyrs with equal appetite. But perhaps the most psychologically sophisticated aspect of these executions was how they transformed death into a communal experience. The crowd wasn't just watching justice being served, they were participating in it. They could cheer for the animals, boo the condemned, or, in rare cases, show mercy by waving handkerchiefs to petition for a pardon. The audience became complicit in the violence, making every death a shared responsibility, and every survival a collective gift. Now, if the arena represented Rome's approach to public execution as entertainment, forced suicide represented the empire's more refined approach to political necessity. This was Roman pragmatism in its most civilized, if we can use that word, for state-sanctioned self-murder. The system worked with elegant simplicity. When a senator, noble, or other high-ranking citizen managed to offend the emperor, perhaps through conspiracy, corruption, or simply existing too confidently, they would receive a visit, not from executioners with axes, but from a messenger with a scroll. The message would be polite, almost cordial. You have brought dishonor upon yourself and the state. The emperor suggests you take the honorable path and end your own life. This wasn't considered cruel or unusual. In Roman high society, it was actually viewed as a privilege, a final act of personal agency in a situation where agency had otherwise been completely stripped away. If you complied with this suggestion, your family could keep your property, your name might be left unblemished in official records, and you could craft your own ending with whatever dignity remained. The method was often as theatrical as the arena deaths, but with a very different aesthetic. Picture a warm bath, a razor blade applied to the wrists, and perhaps a final philosophical monologue delivered to assembled friends and family. It was very much in keeping with Rome's love of dramatic performance, except the audience was smaller and more select. Lucius Annaeus Seneca, the Stoic philosopher and advisor to emperors, faced exactly this situation when accused of participating in a conspiracy against Nero. Whether the charges were true remains debatable, but the sentence was not. Seneca accepted his fate with the kind of philosophical calm he had spent his career advocating. His suicide became legendary, not just for its method, but for its duration. Seneca cut his wrists, then his ankles, but the bleeding wasn't sufficient to kill him quickly. He was eventually placed in a warm bath to encourage blood flow, and when that proved insufficient, he was given hemlock, the same poison that had killed Socrates centuries earlier. Even in death, Seneca managed to connect his end to philosophical tradition. What made forced suicide so effective as a tool of imperial control was how it maintained the illusion of choice while eliminating actual choice. The condemned could tell themselves they were choosing death over dishonor, while everyone involved understood that the only real choice was between dying with dignity or dying messily. It was Roman efficiency wrapped in Roman theater, practical, symbolic, and absolutely final.
If you've ever complained about an uncomfortable chair during a long meeting, I invite you to consider the Roman wooden donkey, a piece of furniture so diabolically designed that it redefined the relationship between sitting and suffering. This wasn't just uncomfortable seating, it was architectural torture, crafted with the precision of Roman engineering and the cruelty of Roman imagination. The wooden donkey wasn't actually shaped like an animal. Instead, it was a tall, narrow, triangular wooden beam, sharpened to a razor-thin peak and supported by an A-frame structure. The condemned, usually thieves, rebellious slaves, or soldiers who had displeased their commanders, were forced to straddle this peak, allowing their full body weight to press down on the sharp edge positioned between their legs. But Roman engineers, never content with simple brutality, found ways to enhance the experience. Weights were often tied to the victim's ankles, adding gravity's assistance to what was already an excruciating ordeal. The longer someone remained on the donkey, the deeper the sharp edge would cut into their flesh, slowly tearing through muscle and potentially causing permanent damage to internal organs. What made this punishment particularly insidious was its scalability. The wooden donkey could serve as either a death sentence or a form of public humiliation, depending on how long the victim was left in position. A few hours might result in severe pain and scarring, but leave the person alive to carry the memory and the physical reminders of their punishment. Extended sessions could prove fatal. Picture the scene in a crowded Roman marketplace. A merchant caught cheating customers is placed on the donkey while vendors sell snacks to the gathering crowd. Children point and laugh while their parents use the spectacle as a teaching moment about honesty in business. It was pain as pedagogy, suffering as social education. Roman military commanders found the wooden donkey particularly useful for field discipline. Soldiers who disobeyed orders, deserted their posts, or showed cowardice could find themselves straddling the device as both punishment and warning to their comrades. Nothing maintained military morale quite like the sight of a fellow soldier's slow deterioration atop a wooden triangle. The Romans, ever innovative, developed variations on the basic design. Some donkeys were made of metal, which could be heated to add burning to the crushing pressure. Others featured spikes along the edges because apparently the original design wasn't quite memorable enough. One historical account even mentions a heated metal version, suggesting that Roman engineers were taking feedback from their torture devices and implementing improvements. What's particularly chilling about the wooden donkey is how it transformed the simple everyday act of sitting into a source of terror. Every chair, every bench, every surface that required straddling became a potential reminder of this punishment. It was psychological warfare that extended far beyond the actual torture session. If the wooden donkey represented Rome's approach to creative punishment, facial branding revealed their practical side. In a world without photography, fingerprinting, or DNA analysis, how do you keep track of criminals and ensure they can't simply move to another city and start fresh? Simple. You burn their crimes onto their faces. Roman branding was performed with heated metal rods shaped into letters that indicated specific crimes. F for fur, thief, C for calumnia, false accuser, and various other letters that served as permanent, portable criminal records.
The branding was performed publicly, usually in the forum or marketplace, ensuring maximum humiliation and serving as live entertainment for the gathered crowd. The process was as brutal as it was effective. A heated iron rod, glowing red from the forge, was pressed into the skin of the forehead, cheek, or sometimes the hand, searing through flesh and leaving a scar that would never fully heal. The smell of burning skin, the screams of the victim, and the hissing sound of metal meeting flesh created a sensory experience that witnesses would remember for years. But branding wasn't just about punishment, it was about social control. Once marked, a criminal became instantly recognizable to everyone they encountered. Job opportunities vanished, marriage prospects disappeared, social interactions became fraught with judgment and suspicion. The branded individual was transformed from a person into a walking advertisement for the consequences of criminal behavior. Runaway slaves received special attention in Rome's branding system. Many were marked with FUG for fugitive, a scarlet letter burned into their flesh that made future escape attempts nearly impossible. If they were caught again after being branded, the punishment escalated significantly, sometimes to death. Some enterprising individuals attempted to remove or disguise their brands through crude surgery, makeup, or even additional scarring that might obscure the original letters. But Roman law anticipated these attempts at brand tampering, making such efforts punishable offenses in themselves. It was like trying to Photoshop your criminal record in an age before computers. Creative, but ultimately futile. The psychological impact of branding extended far beyond the individual victim. Every person who saw a branded criminal was reminded of Roman power and Roman justice. It was a mobile warning system, a living testament to what happened when you crossed the empire. In Rome, they didn't just remember your crimes, they made sure your face did too.
As we delve deeper into the Roman catalog of creative cruelty, we encounter punishments that seem to spring from the fevered imagination of someone with both intimate knowledge of human anatomy and absolutely no regard for human dignity. Tongue removal and the breaking wheel represent Roman punishment at its most coldly calculated. When the Romans decided that someone's words were dangerous enough to warrant permanent silencing, they didn't rely on imprisonment or exile. They went directly to the source of the problem and cut it out. Tongue removal was the empire's surgical solution to blasphemy, sedition, and any form of speech that made powerful people uncomfortable. The procedure itself was conducted without anesthesia, antiseptics, or any consideration for the victim's comfort. Using crude forceps to grip the tongue and a sharp blade to sever it, executioners would either slice through the organ completely or, in some particularly brutal cases, tear it out entirely. The result was immediate, permanent, and devastatingly effective. But tongue removal wasn't just about silencing dangerous speech. It was about creating a living example of what happened to those who spoke out of turn. The victim would survive the procedure, but spend the rest of their life unable to speak clearly, argue their innocence, or even scream properly. They became walking advertisements for the power of Roman censorship. The psychological impact extended far beyond the victim. Every person who encountered someone whose tongue had been removed was reminded of the limits of free speech under Roman rule. It was a form of social conditioning that used human suffering as its primary teaching tool. Early Christian martyrs frequently suffered this fate, their refusal to renounce their faith leading directly to permanent mutilation. Ironically, these acts of silencing often backfired spectacularly. The sight of mutilated Christians only strengthened the resolve of other believers who saw these punishments as evidence of their faith's power to threaten the established order. If tongue removal was surgical precision, the breaking wheel was artistic brutality. This punishment transformed the human body into a grotesque sculpture, systematically shattering bones while keeping the victim alive to experience every moment of the process.
The victim was tied spread-eagle to a large wooden wheel, arms and legs positioned for maximum vulnerability. Then, an executioner, armed with a heavy iron bar, would begin the methodical work of breaking every major bone in the body. Arms first, then legs, each strike precisely calculated to shatter bone while avoiding immediately fatal damage. The goal wasn't to kill quickly, that would defeat the purpose. Instead, the breaking wheel was designed to create a slow, agonizing death while producing a visual spectacle that would haunt witnesses for the rest of their lives. The broken limbs would be woven through the wheel's spokes, creating a human wreath that could be displayed publicly as a warning to others. Sometimes the wheel was hoisted onto a pole and left to spin slowly in the wind, the broken body serving as a macabre weather vane. Other times it was simply positioned where maximum numbers of people would be forced to see it, a reminder of Roman power that couldn't be ignored or forgotten. But perhaps the cruelest punishment in Rome's arsenal was one that targeted not just the body or even the life of its victims, but their very existence in history. Damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory, was Rome's method for making inconvenient people disappear not just from the world, but from the historical record itself. When an emperor, general, or other prominent figure fell sufficiently from grace, the Senate might decree that their memory be officially erased. This wasn't just symbolic, it was a systematic campaign to remove every trace of the person's existence from public view. Statues were smashed or had their faces chiseled away. Names were scraped from inscriptions, sometimes leaving awkward gaps in otherwise complete texts. Portraits were painted over or destroyed. Coins bearing the person's image were recalled and melted down. Official documents were amended to remove any reference to the condemned individual. The most famous example was Emperor Geta, who was murdered by his brother Caracalla in 211 AD. Not content with simply killing his brother, Caracalla ordered a comprehensive erasure of Geta's memory. Thousands of inscriptions across the empire were edited to remove Geta's name. In surviving artwork, you can still see the ghostly outlines where Geta's figure was carefully painted over or chiseled away. Damnatio memoriae was terrifyingly effective. Many of the people subjected to this punishment have been successfully erased from history. We don't even know their names because Rome was that thorough in its deletion campaign. It was historical vaporization carried out with bureaucratic efficiency. What made this punishment so psychologically devastating was how it attacked the fundamental human desire for immortality through memory. Death was inevitable, but Romans believed that living on in the memory of others provided a form of eternal life. Damnatio memoriae cut off this path to immortality, consigning its victims to a death that was both physical and spiritual. In Rome, the cruelest punishment wasn't fire, lions, or breaking wheels. It was silence, the deliberate, systematic forgetting of a human life.
As we close this dark chapter on Roman punishment and step into a completely different world, I want you to imagine the most dramatic contrast possible. We're leaving behind the blood-soaked arenas and calculated cruelties of ancient Rome and traveling to a place where justice was rough, survival was uncertain, but hope burned as bright as a campfire on an endless prairie. Welcome to the American frontier of the early 1800s, where the landscape stretched endlessly westward like a vast, unwritten story waiting for brave souls to fill its pages with their dreams, their struggles, and their determination to build something new from nothing but wilderness and willpower. In the early decades of the 19th century, America was a young nation drunk on possibility and bursting with restless energy. The population was exploding, growing from about 5 million people at independence to over 12 million by 1830. The eastern seaboard, once spacious enough for colonial settlements, now felt crowded and constraining. Cities were growing, factories were smoking, and farmland that had seemed limitless to earlier generations was showing its boundaries. But the West was different.
The West was pure potential, a blank canvas that promised enough space for every dream, every ambition, every hope for a fresh start that the human heart could conceive. The Louisiana Purchase of 1803 had more than doubled the size of the United States overnight, adding over 800,000 square miles of territory that most Americans had never seen, but all could imagine. This wasn't just land, this was freedom made manifest in soil and sky. It called to dreamers and desperados alike, farmers looking for virgin soil that could support their families for generations, widows seeking peace and independence, adventurers chasing legends carved from campfire tales and whispered stories of rivers that sparkled like silver and valleys that bloomed without human effort. The phrase, "Go west, young man," captured something essential about the American spirit, though it wouldn't be coined until later. The idea was already pulsing through the national consciousness like a shared heartbeat. The West represented everything America claimed to be about: opportunity, independence, the chance to reinvent yourself based on what you could do, rather than who your family was or what mistakes you'd made back east. But this romantic vision of westward expansion came with a cost that many Americans preferred not to acknowledge. The Western territories weren't empty wilderness waiting for civilization. They were home to hundreds of indigenous nations who had been living on and managing these lands for thousands of years. The Cherokee in the southeast, the Lakota on the Great Plains, the Comanche in Texas, the Apache in the southwest. All of these peoples had their own sophisticated societies, their own relationships with the land, their own understanding of what it meant to call a place home. The collision between American expansion and Native American sovereignty would define much of the frontier experience. Treaties were signed and broken with depressing regularity. Entire nations were forced to relocate to make room for white settlers. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 authorized the federal government to negotiate the relocation of Native American tribes from their ancestral homelands to designated Indian territory west of the Mississippi River. But let's focus tonight on the settlers themselves, the ordinary families who loaded their possessions into covered wagons and rolled into uncertainty, gambling everything on the promise of something better beyond the horizon. These weren't all heroes or villains from dime novels. They were human beings with human motivations. Parents who wanted their children to have better opportunities, young couples seeking affordable land to start a farm, merchants looking for new markets, miners chasing rumors of gold. The journey west was an act of faith as much as courage. Families would sell their homes, liquidate their possessions, and load what remained into a wagon that would serve as transportation, shelter, and storage for months. They were committing to a journey that might take half a year, across terrain they'd never seen, towards destinations they knew only through stories and rough maps. Think about the magnitude of that decision. No cell phones to check in with relatives back home. No GPS to ensure they were heading in the right direction. No guarantee that the weather would cooperate, that the rivers would be fordable, that they wouldn't encounter hostile forces along the way. Every family that headed west was essentially saying, "We believe in tomorrow more than we fear today." The covered wagon became the symbol of this movement, but it was more than just transportation. It was a home on wheels, a survival pod, a repository for everything a family owned and hoped to build upon. Inside that cramped canvas-covered space were the tools needed to build a new life: farming implements, household goods, family heirlooms, books, musical instruments, and the seeds, literal and metaphorical, for a fresh start. As we explore the frontier experience tonight, we'll meet these pioneers not as mythical figures, but as real people facing real challenges. We'll walk alongside them as they cross rivers, climb mountains, and build communities from scratch in places where the nearest neighbor might be 20 miles away. This is the story of America, writing itself across a continent, one wagon wheel at a time. The covered wagon wasn't a luxury vehicle. It was a survival machine, designed by necessity and refined through trial and error, often tragic error. When families decided to head west, their first challenge wasn't finding the trail or choosing a destination. It was building or buying a vessel that would carry not just their bodies, but their entire future across half a continent. Most families couldn't afford to build a wagon from scratch, so they bought or modified existing carts and farm wagons. The famous Conestoga wagons you see in movies were actually too large and heavy for the frontier. They were built for established roads and short hauls with heavy loads. What pioneers needed was something smaller, lighter, and more maneuverable: the prairie schooner. The prairie schooner got its name from its white canvas top that billowed in the prairie winds like a ship's sail crossing grassy seas. But this ship didn't carry treasure or trade goods. It carried everything a family owned and hoped to build upon: salt pork, flour, beans, coffee if they were lucky, cast iron pots that would last a lifetime if treated properly, a spinning wheel for making cloth, a Bible for Sunday services and daily comfort, maybe one good quilt that had been in the family for generations. Every inch of space was precious, every pound carefully calculated. A fully loaded wagon might carry up to 2,000 pounds, but any more than that would kill the oxen long before they reached their destination. Families had to make heartbreaking decisions about what to bring and what to leave behind. That family piano? Too heavy. Those books, collected over years? Maybe just one or two favorites. Extra clothing? Only what was absolutely essential. The popular image of families riding comfortably inside their covered wagons is mostly Hollywood fiction. The wagons were cramped, filled with supplies, and riding inside meant being bounced and jolted with every rock, rut, and bump in the trail. Most people walked. Men, women, children, grandparents, mile after mile, day after day. It wasn't unusual for families to walk 15 miles in a single day, which might not sound like much until you consider they were doing it while herding livestock, managing children, and dealing with dust, heat, cold, rain, and endless uncertainty. Oxen were the engines of westward expansion, not because they were fast or comfortable, but because they were nearly indestructible. Horses were too delicate for the long journey and required grain that was too precious to spare. Mules were tougher than horses, but more expensive and sometimes unpredictable. Oxen were slow, painfully slow, but they could eat prairie grass, work in all weather, and keep going long after horses would have collapsed. The daily routine on the trail was dictated by the sun, the weather, and the brutal mathematics of survival. Families woke up before sunrise, not because they wanted to, but because they had to. Breaking camp, preparing breakfast, yoking the oxen, and getting the wagon moving again was a process that took hours. The goal was to rolling by sunrise to make the most of the available daylight. Meals were simple, repetitive, and often unsatisfying. Coffee was a luxury that families rationed carefully. Water was always a concern. Streams could be clean and sweet, or they could be contaminated with bacteria that would cause dysentery, cholera, or worse. Sometimes families had no choice but to drink whatever water they could find and hope for the best. The trail itself was marked not just by wagon ruts carved into the earth, but by the debris of previous travelers. Broken wagon wheels, discarded furniture, abandoned supplies, and all too often, graves. The Oregon Trail, the California Trail, the Santa Fe Trail, all of them were lined with the possessions that families had been forced to abandon when their wagons broke down, their animals died, or they simply couldn't carry everything they thought they needed. Disease was the greatest killer on the trail, far more dangerous than Indian attacks or wild animals. Cholera was particularly feared because it killed quickly and seemed to strike randomly. A person could be healthy in the morning and dead by evening. Dysentery was slower but just as deadly, weakening travelers until they couldn't continue. Children were especially vulnerable to diseases, accidents, and the general hardships of trail life. Yet, despite these hardships, there were moments of joy and community that sustained families through the worst times. Children adapted to trail life with remarkable resilience, finding games to play with sticks and stones, racing alongside the wagons, and forming friendships with other children in their wagon train. Adults shared resources, helped each other through difficulties, and created temporary communities that sometimes lasted for months of shared travel. Evening camp was a time for rest, repair, and socialization. Wagons would be arranged in a circle, not primarily for defense against Indian attacks, as Hollywood would have us believe, but for protection against thieves, wild animals, and the prairie winds. Fires were lit, meals were cooked, and sometimes someone would bring out a fiddle or harmonica for music. These were ordinary people doing extraordinary things, walking their way across a continent because they believed something better waited at the end of their journey. After months of walking across prairies, fording rivers, and climbing mountains, the moment when pioneer families finally reached their destination was both triumphant and terrifying. Because finding your spot on the frontier was just the beginning. Now you had to build a life from absolutely nothing but open land and whatever supplies you'd managed to carry in your wagon. Homesteading wasn't romantic or glamorous. There were no pre-built cabins waiting, no welcome committees with casseroles, no infrastructure of any kind. Just you, your family, and however many acres you could claim and defend. The first priority was always shelter, and that usually meant a one-room log cabin that would make a modern walk-in closet look spacious. Building that first cabin was back-breaking work that required skills most settlers had never developed. Every log had to be felled by hand, stripped of bark, cut to length, and somehow transported to the building site. There were no hardware stores, no power tools, no construction crews for hire. Just families working with axes, saws, and whatever other hand tools they'd brought west. The cabins themselves were studies in functional minimalism. Dirt floors that turned to mud when it rained and froze solid in winter. Windows that were often just holes covered with animal hide or paper soaked in grease to let in light while keeping out the worst of the wind. A chimney that might be nothing more than a hole in the roof with some stones arranged around it. Inside, privacy was a luxury that simply didn't exist. Parents, children, grandparents, and sometimes even hired hands all shared the same single room. Beds were rope-strung across wooden frames, if you were lucky enough to have the materials. More often, families slept on piles of straw, corn husks, or whatever soft material could be found or made. But the real heroes of the frontier weren't the men with their axes and plows. They were the women who somehow managed to create civilization out of wilderness using nothing but willpower, ingenuity, and an absolutely unshakable determination to survive. Frontier women were warriors in aprons, and I mean that quite literally. From the moment they stepped off the wagon, they became builders, farmers, teachers, doctors, veterinarians, and defenders of the homestead. If something needed doing, they did it because there was literally no one else available. A typical day for a frontier woman began before sunrise and ended well after sunset. Milk the cows, gather eggs, start the fire, prepare breakfast, pack lunches for anyone working in the fields, tend the garden, preserve food, spin thread, weave cloth, make and mend clothing, teach children to read and write, prepare dinner, clean up, help with evening chores, and maybe, if there was still light left in the day, work on some project that might make tomorrow a little easier. But beyond these daily tasks, frontier women had to be prepared for emergencies that could arise at any moment. If their husband was away and wolves threatened the livestock, they grabbed whatever weapons were available and drove them off. If a neighbor was having a difficult childbirth, they served as midwife. If someone was injured, they provided medical care using whatever herbs and home remedies they knew. Guns were as much a part of a frontier woman's toolkit as cooking pots and sewing needles. They knew how to load, aim, and fire rifles not because they enjoyed violence, but because being defenseless in the wilderness was a luxury they couldn't afford. There are countless stories of women defending their homesteads alone, fighting off everything from wild animals to human predators while their husbands were away on business or hunting trips. Perhaps most challenging of all was the isolation. The nearest neighbor might be 5, 10, or 20 miles away. Letters took weeks or months to reach family back east if the postal service existed in their area at all. For women who had grown up in communities where help was always nearby, this isolation could be psychologically devastating. Yet women found ways to create community even in the vast emptiness of the American West. When a neighbor was sick, women would ride miles to help, bringing food, medicine, and companionship. When a baby was born, other women would come to assist, staying for days or weeks to help the new mother recover. These networks of mutual support became the invisible threads that held frontier society together. Many frontier women also became the unofficial teachers in their communities. Before schools could be built and teachers hired, mothers taught not only their own children, but often the children of neighbors as well. They used whatever books they had, usually a Bible, maybe a primer, perhaps a few treasured volumes brought from back east, to provide education in one-room cabins that served as both home and schoolhouse. The psychological toll of frontier life on women was immense, but rarely acknowledged. They buried children lost to disease, accident, or the harsh realities of frontier life. They mourned husbands killed in farming accidents, Indian raids, or simply worn down by the relentless demands of carving a living from raw land. Yet they had to keep going, because there was no alternative. The farm needed tending, the children needed raising, and survival demanded that grief be processed quickly and quietly. But perhaps most remarkably, many frontier women not only survived these challenges, they thrived. They became the backbone of frontier communities, organizing schools, churches, and social institutions. They preserved culture and civilization in places where both seemed impossible. They raised children who would become the next generation of Americans, passing on values of hard work, self-reliance, and community support that would define the American character for generations.
But for every wagon that rolled westward, for every cabin raised and field plowed, there was already someone there. The American frontier wasn't empty wilderness waiting for civilization. It was home to hundreds of indigenous nations who had been living on and managing these lands for thousands of years. From the Great Plains to the Pacific Coast, from the Rocky Mountains to the southwestern deserts, the land was deeply woven with Native American life. These weren't nomadic wanderers drifting aimlessly across empty spaces. These were sophisticated societies with their own forms of government, their own relationships with the land, their own understanding of what it meant to call a place home. The Cherokee in the southeast had developed a written constitution and published their own newspaper. The Lakota on the Great Plains had evolved complex systems of seasonal migration that allowed them to harvest the resources of vast territories without depleting them. The Pueblo peoples of the Southwest had built cities and developed agricultural techniques that sustained large populations in arid environments. The Pacific Northwest tribes had created art, architecture, and social systems of remarkable sophistication. But to the U.S. government and to most American settlers, this wasn't seen as civilization. It was seen as an obstacle to progress. The prevailing attitude was that land not being used in European-style agriculture was being wasted, and that Native Americans were preventing the land from reaching its full potential. This fundamental misunderstanding or deliberate misrepresentation of Native American society led to a long, tragic series of broken promises and violent conflicts. The U.S. government signed treaty after treaty with Native tribes, agreements that promised peace,
respect for tribal boundaries, and protection of native rights. But these treaties were broken almost as soon as they were signed. As settlers poured westward, native tribes found themselves under increasing pressure. Sometimes the pressure was legal. State governments would pass laws invalidating tribal authority or opening native lands to white settlement. Sometimes it was economic. Traders would cheat native peoples or introduce alcohol and other destructive influences. And sometimes it was simply violent. Militia groups would attack native villages, or individual settlers would kill native people with little fear of consequences. Some native groups tried diplomacy, working within the American legal system to protect their rights. Others chose armed resistance, fighting to defend their homelands against invasion. But regardless of their strategy, the outcome was usually the same. Native peoples were forced to give up their ancestral territories and relocate to designated reservations, often hundreds of miles from their traditional homes. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 had formalized this process in the Southeast, leading to tragedies like the Trail of Tears. But removal continued throughout the 19th century as American expansion reached into every corner of the continent. The California Gold Rush brought thousands of miners into native territories, leading to what many historians now recognize as genocidal violence against native peoples. The construction of the Transcontinental Railroad cut through native hunting grounds and sacred sites. The systematic slaughter of buffalo herds eliminated the economic base of plains tribes. But the assault on Native Americans wasn't just physical, it was cultural. Children were taken from their families and sent to boarding schools where they were forbidden to speak their native languages, practice their traditional religions, or maintain connections to their tribal identities. The goal, in the words of one administrator, was to kill the Indian and save the man. Sacred sites were destroyed or desecrated. Traditional forms of government were outlawed. Religious practices were banned. The goal was nothing less than the complete erasure of Native American identity and culture. Yet despite this systematic campaign of cultural genocide, Native peoples survived. Languages were preserved in secret. Religious ceremonies continued in hidden locations. Stories and traditions were passed down from grandparent to grandchild. The spirit of resistance that had motivated leaders like Sitting Bull, Geronimo, and Chief Joseph lived on in quieter but no less determined forms. Today, Native American communities continue to fight for recognition of their sovereignty, protection of their remaining lands, and preservation of their cultures. The romantic image of the frontier as empty wilderness being tamed by brave pioneers has gradually given way to a more complex understanding of westward expansion as a collision between different ways of life, with devastating consequences for the peoples who were already here. To understand the American frontier fully, we must hold both truths simultaneously. The courage and determination of the pioneers who built new lives in challenging circumstances, and the tragedy of the peoples who were displaced, killed, or culturally destroyed in the process. The frontier was a place of both opportunity and catastrophe, of dreams fulfilled and dreams destroyed. The land itself remembers all of these stories, the wagon ruts and the battlefields, the homesteads and the sacred sites, the railroads, and the reservation boundaries. And in understanding this complex history, we come closer to understanding the true cost and the true meaning of the American experience. On the American frontier, law and order arrived late and sometimes not at all. In many newly settled towns, there were no police forces, no established courthouses, and no jails. Justice was less about due process and constitutional rights and more about who had the loudest voice, the fastest draw, or the biggest gang backing them up. In the absence of formal legal systems, frontier communities often relied on vigilante justice. When a crime was committed, a horse stolen, a shop robbed, or worse, citizens would form committees to investigate, try, and punish the accused. These makeshift trials might take place in saloons, under trees, or in the main street of town, with the entire community serving as judge and jury. The punishments handed out by these vigilante committees were swift and often harsh. A convicted horse thief might be hanged from the nearest tree. A claim jumper might be run out of town with a warning never to return. A murderer might face a firing squad organized by the victim's friends and neighbors. There was no appeals process, no lengthy deliberation, no consideration of mitigating circumstances. As towns grew and prospered, they began to attract professional lawmen, sheriffs, marshals, and deputies who brought at least the appearance of official authority to frontier justice. Names like Wyatt Earp, Bat Masterson, and Wild Bill Hickok became legendary, though the reality of their careers was often quite different from the myths that grew up around them. Many frontier lawmen were former criminals themselves, men who understood the criminal mind because they had once lived on the wrong side of the law. Some were honest peace officers trying to bring order to chaotic communities. Others were little better than the outlaws they were supposed to arrest, using their badges as licenses for extortion, violence, and corruption. The frontier was a magnet for people who wanted to escape their pasts, and that included both those fleeing justice and those fleeing injustice. Deserters from the army, escaped slaves, political refugees, and common criminals all headed west, where questions about your background were considered impolite and often dangerous to ask. But alongside the criminals came the outlaws who would capture the American imagination for generations to come. Men like Jesse James, Butch Cassidy, and Billy the Kid didn't just rob banks and trains. They became folk heroes, celebrated in newspapers and dime novels as romantic figures rebelling against authority and corporate power. The reality was usually much less romantic. These outlaws left trails of dead bodies, ruined lives, and terrorized communities behind them. But in an era when many Americans felt powerless against the growing influence of railroads, banks, and big business, outlaws represented a kind of defiant individualism that resonated with popular sentiment. Frontier justice was notoriously unpredictable. A man might be hanged for stealing a horse, while a murderer walked free if the jury liked his story or feared his friends. Bribery was common, witness intimidation was routine, and judges sometimes made decisions based more on popular opinion than legal precedent. Even when formal courts were established, they often operated under primitive conditions. A courtroom might be nothing more than a saloon with a makeshift bench for the judge. The same person who served as judge might also run the general store, operate the telegraph office, or practice medicine on the side. Legal procedures were simplified out of necessity, and constitutional niceties were often ignored in favor of practical solutions. But despite all the chaos and corruption, frontier communities gradually developed more sophisticated legal systems. As populations grew and property values increased, the need for predictable, impartial justice became more pressing. Professional judges replaced part-time volunteers. Proper jails were built to replace makeshift holding areas. Legal procedures became more standardized and less dependent on local whims. The myths and legends that grew out of frontier justice have never died. The image of the lone sheriff facing down outlaws in the main street of a dusty western town remains one of America's most enduring cultural symbols. Movies, television shows, and novels continue to draw on these themes, usually romanticizing the violence and simplifying the moral complexities of frontier life. Yet beneath the mythology lies an important truth about American character and values. The frontier experience taught Americans to be self-reliant, to take justice into their own hands when necessary, and to be skeptical of authority that seemed distant or unresponsive to local needs. These attitudes continue to influence American politics and culture today. The frontier was a place where traditional authority structures broke down and had to be rebuilt from scratch. In that process, Americans developed their own distinctive approaches to law, order, and justice, approaches that emphasized individual rights, community participation, and suspicion of centralized power. On the edge of the known world, justice wasn't blind. It was armed, dusty, and didn't ask twice. But it was also, in its rough way, democratic, reflecting the will and values of the communities that created it.
At first, the American frontier moved at the speed of a wagon wheel, slow, creaky, and entirely dependent on weather, terrain, and the endurance of oxen. But by the mid to late 1800s, the silence of the prairie was shattered by sounds that would transform the frontier forever: the steam whistle of locomotives and the clicking of telegraph keys. The arrival of the railroad changed everything about westward expansion. Journeys that had once taken months of arduous walking could now be completed in days of relatively comfortable travel. The Transcontinental Railroad, completed in 1869 when the Central Pacific and Union Pacific lines met at Promontory Point, Utah, created a steel spine that connected the Atlantic and Pacific coasts for the first time in human history. For settlers, the railroad meant survival in ways that went far beyond simple transportation. Medicine could now reach frontier communities before a fever epidemic turned deadly. Manufactured goods, everything from cast iron stoves to sewing needles, could be shipped west at reasonable cost, eliminating the need to make everything by hand or do without. Crops could be sold to distant markets, turning subsistence farming into commercial agriculture. Towns sprang up overnight beside railroad depots, creating instant communities where none had existed before. These railroad towns followed a predictable pattern: a depot, a grain elevator, a general store, a saloon, and a hotel, all lined up along the tracks like beads on a string. Some of these towns thrived and grew into cities. Others withered and died when the railroad moved on or when the economic conditions that had created them changed. But the railroad didn't travel alone. Alongside the steel rails ran the telegraph wires, thin strands of copper that carried dots and dashes across the continent at the speed of electricity. The telegraph gave frontier communities something they had never had before: instant communication with the outside world. A rancher in Wyoming could now receive news of a presidential election within minutes of the votes being counted in Washington, D.C. A sheriff in a small Kansas town could telegraph for help from law enforcement agencies hundreds of miles away. A merchant could check commodity prices in Chicago before deciding what crops to buy from local farmers. The isolation that had defined frontier life began to break down as communities became connected to a vast network of information and communication. The impact of these technologies on frontier life was profound and immediate. Economic opportunities expanded as local producers gained access to national markets. Government authority reached farther as federal agencies could communicate quickly with local officials. Law enforcement became more effective as criminals could no longer simply disappear into the vast anonymity of the frontier. But not everyone welcomed these changes. Many Native American tribes saw railroads and telegraph lines as symbols of invasion and permanent occupation. The railroads brought not just individual settlers, but entire military units that could be deployed quickly to any trouble spot. The telegraph allowed for coordinated military campaigns across vast distances. Some tribes fought back by attacking railroad construction crews, derailing trains, and cutting telegraph wires. These acts of resistance were usually portrayed in the press as unprovoked attacks on innocent civilians, but they were actually strategic attempts to slow or stop the technological conquest of native lands. The environmental impact of railroad construction was also significant. Building the Transcontinental Railroad required enormous amounts of timber for railroad ties, bridges, and fuel. Entire forests were cut down to feed the railroad's appetite for wood.
The buffalo herds that had sustained plains tribes for centuries were systematically slaughtered, partly for their hides, but also to eliminate the economic base of native resistance. As the railroad network expanded, the character of the frontier began to change. The self-reliant individualism that had defined frontier life gave way to increasing dependence on outside suppliers, markets, and authorities. Local communities became nodes in a larger economic and communication network rather than independent entities. Towns that the railroad bypassed were often doomed to stagnation or abandonment. Ghost towns began to dot the western landscape, places that had thrived for a few years while serving some temporary economic function, then withered away when that function was no longer needed. The railroad also democratized westward migration, making it possible for people who couldn't afford a wagon and oxen to reach the frontier. Immigrants from Europe could travel directly from East Coast ports to frontier communities in a matter of days. This influx of new settlers accelerated the pace of development and increased competition for land and resources. By the 1880s, the frontier was no longer isolated from the rest of American society. It was connected, networked, and increasingly integrated into the national economy. The age of the solitary pioneer carving a life from the wilderness was ending, replaced by an era of corporate agriculture, industrial mining, and commercial development. The frontier was still wild, but now it ran on steam and signals. The romance of the untamed West was giving way to the reality of an industrializing America where even the most remote communities were connected to the larger currents of national and global change. By the end of the 19th century, something profound had happened to the American landscape and the American psyche. The frontier line that had once separated wilderness from settlement, the moving boundary that had defined American expansion for nearly 3 centuries, had blurred, faded, and finally disappeared altogether. In 1890, the U.S. Census Bureau made an announcement that seemed simple but carried enormous implications. There can hardly be said to be a frontier line. In other words, the American frontier was officially closed. The great westward migration was over. The continent had been crossed, claimed, and cataloged. The statistics told the story. The forests had been cleared or claimed. The railroads connected every major population center from coast to coast. The buffalo herds that had once darkened the plains were reduced to a few hundred animals in protected reserves. Native American tribes had been confined to reservations. The vast grasslands were being divided into farms and ranches, their boundaries marked by the new invention of barbed wire. For some Americans, this represented the ultimate triumph. The dream of manifest destiny had been realized. A continent had been tamed, a nation stretched from sea to shining sea. The United States had fulfilled what many believed was its God-given mission to expand across North America and bring civilization to the wilderness. But for others, especially Native Americans and displaced communities, the closing of the frontier meant something very different: the end of a way of life, the loss of ancestral homelands, and the beginning of a new form of existence on reservations that were often located on the least desirable land the government could find. Yet the end of the frontier wasn't just about geography or demographics. It was about American identity itself. For generations, Americans had defined themselves in relation to the frontier. The frontier represented opportunity, freedom, the chance to reinvent yourself and start over. It embodied the American belief that with enough hard work and determination, anyone could create a better life. Historian Frederick Jackson Turner articulated this idea in his famous 1893 essay, The Significance of the Frontier in American History. Turner argued that the frontier experience had shaped American character in fundamental ways. It had created the rugged individualism, democratic spirit, and restless energy that Americans saw as their defining characteristics. According to Turner, The frontier had served as a safety valve for American society, providing an outlet for people who were dissatisfied with their circumstances in settled areas. It had promoted equality by creating conditions where success depended more on personal ability than on family background or inherited wealth. It had fostered innovation by forcing people to adapt to new environments and solve novel problems. But now, that safety valve was closed. The frontier that had shaped American democracy, individualism, and optimism was gone. What would this mean for American society and American character? Some observers worried that without the frontier, America would become more like European societies, more stratified, more rigid, less dynamic. Others argued that Americans would simply find new frontiers to conquer, whether in industry, science, or global expansion. The reality, as it turned out, was more complex. The frontier didn't really close in 1890, it was transformed. The physical frontier of geographic expansion was replaced by other kinds of frontiers: technological, economic, and eventually global. Americans channeled their frontier spirit into building industrial empires, exploring new scientific frontiers, and eventually extending American influence around the world. The myths and legends of the frontier era also took on new life as the actual frontier disappeared. Wild West shows, dime novels, and later movies and television programs created a romanticized version of frontier life that bore little resemblance to the historical reality, but satisfied a deep psychological need for adventure and heroism. The cowboy became an enduring symbol of American values, even though the actual era of the cattle drives lasted only about 20 years. The frontier gunfighter became a cultural icon, even though most frontier communities were actually quite peaceful. The log cabin became a symbol of democratic simplicity, even though most frontier families lived in more modest structures. These myths weren't just harmless entertainment. They shaped how Americans understood their history and their national character. The frontier experience became a lens through which Americans interpreted their role in the world and their approach to new challenges. The closing of the frontier also marked the beginning of a new relationship between Americans and their environment. The frontier had been seen as an inexhaustible resource, something to be conquered and exploited. But as the frontier disappeared, some Americans began to recognize the need for conservation and environmental protection. The establishment of Yellowstone as the world's first national park in 1872 represented a new way of thinking about wilderness, not as an obstacle to be overcome, but as a resource to be preserved. This conservation movement would grow in importance as Americans realized that the frontier's apparent infinity had been an illusion. Today, the frontier lives on not in geography, but in spirit and imagination. Americans continue to see themselves as a frontier people, ready to explore new territories, whether they're in outer space, cyberspace, or the frontiers of human knowledge and capability. The wagons no longer roll westward, but the frontier spirit continues to shape American dreams and aspirations. The frontier closed, but in closing, it became the foundation of American identity.
Now, my friends, we're going to travel even further back in time, to a place and an era that existed long before Rome's brutal spectacles or America's westward expansion. We're going back to the very beginning of something that has accompanied humanity through every triumph and tragedy, every celebration and sorrow, every moment of transcendence and despair. We're going back to the birth of music itself. Before there were instruments carved from bone or wood, before there were strings stretched across wooden frames, before there were drums made from animal hide, there was rhythm, the beat of a foot on earth,
the clap of two hands coming together, the thump of a heart in a quiet chest. Music did not begin with sophisticated instruments or complex compositions. It began with the human body. It began with breath. Tens of thousands of years ago, long before writing systems recorded human thoughts, long before agriculture allowed permanent settlements, long before architecture created lasting monuments, early humans discovered something extraordinary about sound. In caves and on open plains, around fires and in deep forests, they found that certain movements, a stomp, a shout, a whistle, could stir emotions, capture attention, or even provide comfort in the face of fear and uncertainty. Music, it seems, is not merely a cultural invention like pottery or metallurgy. It appears to be a biological instinct as fundamental to human nature as language or tool-making. Modern neuroscience confirms what ancient peoples understood intuitively. Music activates multiple areas of the brain simultaneously, triggering emotional responses that seem to bypass rational thought and speak directly to something deeper within us. Imagine, if you can, a small group of hunter-gatherers huddled around a flickering fire as darkness falls around them. The day has been long and difficult. Food has been scarce. Dangers lurk in the shadows beyond the circle of light. But then, spontaneously, one person begins to hum. A low, rising tone that seems to emerge from somewhere deep in the chest. Another person joins in, clapping hands in rhythm with the humming. A third begins to mimic the calls of birds they heard during the day's hunt. There are no words yet, just sound, pure, unformed, but somehow meaningful. And in that moment, something magical happens. These individuals, bound together by necessity and survival, become something more than the sum of their parts. They become a community united by shared rhythm and melody. This is how music began, not as entertainment for leisure moments, but as a fundamental way of creating and maintaining human connection. Before language developed enough complexity to express abstract concepts like love, loss, hope, or fear, music provided a means of communicating these essential human experiences. Many anthropologists believe that early music may have emerged from practical necessity. Hunters learned to mimic animal calls to lure prey or communicate with each other across long distances. Workers discovered that singing together helped coordinate group activities and made repetitive tasks more bearable. Parents found that humming or crooning could calm frightened children or help them sleep. But at some point, these functional uses of sound crossed a crucial threshold. A rhythm became more than just a work song. It became an expression of joy. A call became more than just a hunting technique. It became a celebration of successful cooperation. A lullaby became more than just a practical tool for childcare. It became an expression of love and protection. There's a fascinating theory proposed by some evolutionary psychologists that music actually preceded language in human development. According to this idea, before we developed the complex grammatical structures that allow us to construct sentences and express abstract ideas, We communicated through what these researchers call proto-language, a musical form of expression that combined rhythm, melody, and emotional content without the precise meanings that characterize modern speech. If this theory is correct, then every time a baby responds more readily to a lullaby than to spoken words, every time a person finds themselves humming unconsciously while working, every time a crowd of strangers feels united by singing together, we're tapping into something incredibly ancient and fundamental about human nature. What's particularly beautiful about these first musical expressions is their universality. Music wasn't invented in one place and then spread to others through trade or conquest. It emerged independently in human communities across all continents, wherever groups of people gathered together and felt the need to express something that words couldn't capture. The rhythms of African drums, the melodies of Asian flutes, the harmonies of European folk songs, the chants of Native American ceremonies, all of these represent different branches of the same ancient tree, different expressions of the same fundamental human impulse to create meaning and connection through organized sound. Before the first cities were built, before the first empires rose and fell, before the first written languages preserved human thoughts for posterity, our ancestors were already creating music. They were already discovering that sound, arranged with intention and performed with skill, could bridge the gap between individual consciousness and shared experience. Music made us human, and we have been making music ever since.
In the bitter cold of Ice Age Europe, where mammoths still roamed across frozen landscapes and glaciers carved deep valleys through mountain ranges, a quiet revolution was taking place. Not a revolution in tools or fire-making or hunting techniques, but a revolution in the relationship between humans and sound itself. Somewhere in a cave, perhaps during the long, dark months of winter when there was little to do but wait for spring's return, an early human picked up a hollow bird bone and noticed something interesting about it. When air was blown through it, it produced a tone, not just any sound, but a clear, pure, intentional musical note. This moment, repeated countless times across thousands of years, represents one of the most significant developments in human cultural evolution, the birth of the musical instrument. Archaeologists have uncovered bone flutes dating back over 40,000 years, making them among the oldest known instruments on Earth and predating many other technologies we consider fundamental to human civilization. These ancient flutes, found in sites like the Hohlfels Cave in Germany, were made from the wing bones of vultures or carved from mammoth ivory, materials that were neither easy to work with nor readily available. The fact that Ice Age humans invested the time and effort required to create these instruments tells us something profound about their priorities and their understanding of what made life worth living. The precision required to create a functional flute is remarkable. The maker had to carefully hollow out the bone, drill finger holes at exactly the right intervals to produce different notes, and polish the mouthpiece to allow for proper airflow. This wasn't random experimentation, it was deliberate craftsmanship aimed at producing specific musical results. But why did they do it? What drove people who were constantly concerned with finding food, avoiding predators, and surviving harsh weather conditions to spend precious time and energy creating musical instruments? Perhaps the sound of a flute could mimic bird songs, serving as a kind of auditory camouflage during hunting expeditions. Perhaps flute music accompanied religious rituals, helping to induce the altered states of consciousness that shamans and spiritual leaders sought in their communication with the spirit world.
Perhaps someone simply discovered that making music brought joy and beauty into lives that were often harsh and uncertain. Or maybe, and this might be the most profound possibility, someone created a flute because they had heard music in their imagination and wanted to make it real. The flute represented humanity's first attempt to externalize the music that existed in the mind, to share internal experiences of rhythm and melody with others. These Ice Age flutes also suggest the existence of sophisticated musical communities. A flute played alone can create melody, but its true potential is realized when it's combined with other instruments, voices, or rhythmic accompaniment. Around campfires 40,000 years ago, these early musicians may have been creating the first orchestras, combining flutes with clapping, singing, and percussion instruments made from logs, stones, or hollow gourds. These social implications of this musical activity are staggering. Music making requires cooperation, timing, and shared cultural understanding. It creates bonds between performers and between performers and their audiences. It establishes cultural traditions that can be passed from generation to generation. In a very real sense, these early musical communities were laying the foundation for all subsequent human culture. What's particularly remarkable about these ancient instruments is how they challenge our assumptions about prehistoric human life. We often imagine our Ice Age ancestors as crude creatures focused solely on survival, but the existence of sophisticated musical instruments suggests something much more complex. These were people who valued beauty, who sought transcendence, who understood that life needed more than just food and shelter to be worth living. The flutes also represent humanity's first step toward conquering the limitations of the human body. The voice could produce music, but it was limited in range and volume. Clapping and stomping could create rhythm, but the patterns were relatively simple. The flute extended human musical capabilities, allowing for melodies that were more complex, more varied, and more emotionally expressive than anything the voice alone could achieve. Over time, the basic principles discovered by these Ice Age innovators would be applied to create an incredible variety of wind instruments. The wooden recorders of medieval Europe, the ancient trumpets of ancient Egypt, the bamboo flutes of Asia, the panpipes of South America. All of these represent variations on the fundamental insight that air moving through a tube can be controlled and manipulated to produce beautiful and meaningful sounds. But none of these later developments would have been possible without that first moment when someone looked at a hollow bone and saw not just refuse from a meal, but the raw material for creating beauty. In that moment of recognition, humanity took a crucial step toward becoming not just a species that could survive in the world, but one that could transform the world through imagination and creativity. The Ice Age flutes weren't just tools, they were declarations of humanity's refusal to accept a world without music, without beauty, without the possibility of transcendence through art.
If the flute was humanity's first voice, extended beyond the limitations of the throat, then the drum was our heartbeat made audible to the world. Long before cities rose from river valleys, long before kings claimed dominion over vast territories, there were circles of people gathered under star-filled skies, clapping, stomping, and pounding rhythm into the earth with an intensity that connected them not just to each other, but to the pulse of life itself. The drum didn't emerge from a single moment of inspiration like the flute might have. Instead, it seems to have been discovered independently by human communities across every continent, as if the marriage between human hand and resonant surface was so natural, so inevitable, that it occurred wherever people gathered and needed to express the rhythms they felt within themselves. The earliest drums were almost certainly simple affairs: animal skins stretched over hollow logs, clay pots, or even just the ground itself. They were instruments of rhythm rather than melody,
But rhythm is in many ways more fundamental than melody. Rhythm is the heartbeat, the breathing pattern, the walking pace. Rhythm is what connects us to the natural cycles of day and night, seasons and tides, life and death. In Africa, drum traditions that stretch back tens of thousands of years developed into something approaching a language. Different rhythmic patterns could convey specific messages across long distances, allowing communities to communicate news, warnings, and celebrations from village to village. These talking drums weren't just musical instruments, they were the first telecommunications networks, carrying information across vast distances with a speed and efficiency that wouldn't be matched until the invention of the telegraph. In the shamanic traditions of Siberia, drums served as vehicles for spiritual travel. Shamans would beat repetitive rhythms that induced trance states, allowing them to journey to other worlds, communicate with spirits, and return with healing knowledge for their communities. The drum wasn't just accompanying the spiritual journey, it was the engine that made the journey possible. In the Amazon rainforest, water drums created sounds that seemed to emerge from the earth itself. These instruments, partially filled with water to change their tone and resonance, produced deep, thunderous rhythms that echoed through the jungle canopy like the voice of the forest itself, speaking to those who knew how to listen. What made drums so universally appealing wasn't just their sound, but their accessibility. Unlike wind instruments, which required specific mouth techniques, or stringed instruments, which needed precise finger placement, drums could be played by anyone who could move their hands. Children learned to drum almost as soon as they could walk. Adults who had never received musical training could participate in drumming circles. The elderly, whose voices might have grown weak, could still contribute to the musical life of their communities through drumming. This accessibility made drums powerful tools for building and maintaining community. When a village gathered for ceremonies, celebrations, or important discussions, drumming created a shared rhythmic foundation that helped unify the group's energy and attention. People who might disagree about many things could still find common ground in the basic human response to rhythm. Drums also served practical functions that went beyond music and ceremony. Farmers used drumming to scare birds away from crops. Military forces used drums to coordinate troop movements and boost morale before battles. Workers in various trades discovered that singing and drumming together helped them coordinate their efforts and make difficult tasks more bearable. But perhaps most importantly, drums helped humans externalize and share their internal sense of time. Before clocks divided the day into precise units, people relied on natural rhythms, the beating of their hearts, the pace of their breathing, the rhythm of their walking. Drumming allowed communities to synchronize these individual rhythms into collective time, creating shared temporal frameworks that could coordinate group activities. The social psychology of drumming is fascinating. When people drum together, their heartbeats and brainwaves tend to synchronize, creating a physiological basis for the sense of unity and connection that drumming circles produce. Modern neuroscience has confirmed what traditional cultures always knew. Drumming together literally makes people more connected to each other at a biological level. As human societies became more complex, drums evolved to match their sophistication. Different cultures developed distinctive drumming styles, rhythmic patterns, and instrument designs that reflected their particular values, beliefs, and aesthetic preferences. But underneath all this cultural variation, the fundamental appeal of the drum remained constant. It was the sound of human community made audible, the rhythm of collective life given physical form. Drums were also among humanity's first attempts to create objects that were valued not just for their practical utility, but for their beauty and spiritual significance. Drums were often decorated with carvings, paintings, and other artistic elements that reflected their sacred role in community life. They became repositories of cultural meaning, objects that carried the history, values, and identity of the people who made and used them. In a world before written language, before permanent architecture, before many of the technologies we consider essential to civilization, drums provided continuity and connection across generations.
As humanity transitioned from nomadic hunter-gatherer societies to settled agricultural communities, and eventually to the world's first cities and civilizations, music underwent a transformation as dramatic as any other aspect of human culture. What had begun as spontaneous expressions of rhythm and melody around campfires evolved into sophisticated art forms that reflected the complexity, wealth, and spiritual aspirations of emerging civilizations. Nowhere is this transformation more evident than in ancient Mesopotamia, the region between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers where some of humanity's first cities arose. Here, in places like Ur, Babylon, and Nineveh, music began to look elegant, refined, and deliberately artistic in ways that would have been impossible in earlier, simpler societies. Among the ziggurats and temples of these ancient cities, archaeologists have uncovered some of the earliest depictions of stringed instruments, harps and lyres, that were not crude experimental tools, but sophisticated instruments crafted with remarkable skill and artistic vision. These weren't the functional flutes and drums of nomadic peoples, but luxury objects that required specialized craftsmen, valuable materials, and significant economic resources to create. The royal cemetery of Ur, dating to around 2600 BCE, contained golden harps and lyres that were works of art as much as musical instruments. Decorated with precious metals, semi-precious stones, and intricate carvings, these instruments were clearly symbols of wealth, power, and cultural sophistication. They represented not just musical technology, but the emergence of a society wealthy enough to support non-essential luxuries and skilled enough to create objects of lasting beauty. These early stringed instruments also reveal something important about the social organization of early civilizations. Unlike drums or simple flutes, which could be made by anyone with basic materials, harps and lyres required specialized knowledge and expensive materials. Their existence implies the presence of professional musicians, wealthy patrons, and social institutions capable of supporting artistic activity. In Mesopotamian society, music became increasingly connected to religious and royal ceremonies. Temple musicians held positions of significant social status, serving not just as entertainers, but as intermediaries between the human and divine worlds. Royal courts employed musicians to provide entertainment, mark important ceremonies, and demonstrate the cultural sophistication of the ruler. The development of musical notation systems in these early civilizations represents another crucial step in music's evolution. For the first time, musical knowledge could be preserved in written form, allowing complex compositions to be transmitted accurately across time and space. This development transformed music from a purely oral tradition into something that could be studied, analyzed, and deliberately refined. The Mesopotamians also began to explore the mathematical relationships underlying musical harmony. They discovered that strings of different lengths produced notes that sounded pleasant together, and they began to develop systematic approaches to creating pleasing combinations of sounds. This mathematical approach to music would later be refined by the Greeks and would form the foundation of Western music theory. But Mesopotamian civilization also reveals something darker about the relationship between music and power.
These elaborate instruments and sophisticated musical systems existed alongside slavery, warfare, and extreme social inequality. The golden harps buried with Mesopotamian rulers were created by craftsmen who may have been slaves, and they were buried alongside servants who were killed to accompany their masters into the afterlife. This pattern, music as both artistic achievement and symbol of social hierarchy, would be repeated throughout human history. The most beautiful and sophisticated musical instruments often belong to the most powerful and wealthy members of society, while ordinary people continued to make music with simpler, more accessible tools. The transition from simple folk music to complex artistic compositions also changed the relationship between performers and audiences. In hunter-gatherer societies, music was typically a participatory activity, where everyone present could join in singing, clapping, or dancing. But as music became more technically sophisticated, it increasingly became something performed by specialists for passive audiences. This specialization had both positive and negative consequences. On one hand, it allowed for the development of much more complex and beautiful musical compositions than would have been possible with purely participatory music. On the other hand, it began to create divisions between musical experts and ordinary people, potentially alienating some people from active musical participation. The emergence of professional musicians also created new social categories and career paths. For the first time in human history, people could make their living primarily through musical performance rather than hunting, farming, or crafting. This professionalization of music contributed to its rapid development as an art form, as full-time musicians had both the time and incentive to develop their skills to high levels. The religious dimensions of music also became more elaborate in early civilizations. Mesopotamian temples developed complex musical rituals that were believed to influence the gods, predict the future, and maintain cosmic order. Music wasn't just entertainment or artistic expression. It was a technology for managing humanity's relationship with divine powers. This connection between music and religious authority would prove to be one of the most enduring aspects of musical development, influencing musical traditions from ancient Egypt to medieval Europe to contemporary religious practices around the world.
In ancient Egypt, music transcended mere entertainment to become a divine language that connected the earthly realm with the gods themselves. The Egyptians believed that music was a gift from the goddesses, first from Bat and later from Hathor, the goddess of joy, fertility, and music, who had brought song into the world as a bridge between mortal and divine consciousness. This sacred understanding of music permeated every aspect of Egyptian society. Unlike the purely functional music of earlier civilizations, Egyptian music was simultaneously practical and mystical, serving both everyday needs and profound spiritual purposes. Workers sang rhythmic songs while building the pyramids, not just to coordinate their efforts and make the work more bearable, but because they believed the right rhythms could invoke divine assistance in their monumental undertakings. The most iconic Egyptian instruments reflected this blend of artistry and spirituality. Egyptian harps evolved from simple angular designs to large, curved, magnificently decorated instruments with up to 22 strings. These weren't just musical tools, they were sculptures, architectural elements, and religious artifacts all combined into single objects of breathtaking beauty and sophistication. But perhaps no Egyptian instrument carried more spiritual significance than the sistrum, a type of rattle with metal rods that jingled when shaken. The sistrum was closely associated with goddess worship, particularly the cults of Hathor and Isis. Its sound wasn't meant for entertainment or even traditional musical accompaniment. It was designed to awaken divine consciousness, to shake off evil influences, and to protect the soul during sacred ceremonies. The religious function of music in Egypt extended far beyond temple ceremonies.
Egyptian funeral traditions included elaborate musical components designed to guide the souls of the deceased through the dangerous journey of the afterlife. Tombs of wealthy Egyptians often contained not just preserved instruments, but detailed paintings and hieroglyphic instructions for musicians, as if to ensure that the departed would be accompanied by beautiful music throughout eternity. This Egyptian synthesis of music, spirituality, and artistic sophistication would profoundly influence Greek civilization, but the Greeks would take musical development in new directions that reflected their distinctive intellectual and cultural values. To the ancient Greeks, music wasn't just an art form or even a spiritual practice. It was a science of the soul and a key to understanding the fundamental structure of the universe itself. While other civilizations had used music for ritual and celebration, the Greeks asked deeper questions. Why does sound move us emotionally? What makes certain combinations of notes pleasing while others sound discordant? How can we understand and systematize the principles underlying musical beauty? The answers to these questions came from an unexpected source: mathematics. Pythagoras, the philosopher best known today for his geometric theorem, played a revolutionary role in the development of music theory by discovering that musical harmony was based on simple mathematical ratios. According to legend, Pythagoras made this discovery while passing a blacksmith's shop and noticing that hammers of different weights produced different pitches when they struck metal. This observation led him to experiment with strings of different lengths, and he discovered that when a string was divided according to simple ratios, 1 to 2, 2 to 3, 3 to 4, it produced harmonious, pleasing combinations of notes. This revelation led to one of the most beautiful concepts in ancient philosophy, the harmony of the spheres. Pythagoras and his followers believed that the cosmos itself operated according to the same mathematical principles that governed musical harmony. In their view, the planets moved through space according to musical ratios, creating a cosmic symphony that was normally inaudible to human ears, but that could be understood through the study of earthly music. This mathematical approach to music had profound implications for Greek culture and education. Music wasn't just entertainment, it was a window into the fundamental order of reality. Every plucked string was potentially a mirror of celestial mechanics, every melody a reflection of cosmic harmony. Greek instruments reflected this philosophical sophistication. The lyre, a small harp-like instrument, became the symbol of civilized education and cultural refinement. Poets like Homer were traditionally depicted with lyres, emphasizing the connection between musical and literary arts. The aulos, a double reed pipe, provided emotional contrast in Greek dramas and religious ceremonies, capable of expressing the wild, passionate aspects of human experience that complemented the lyre's more rational harmonies. But the Greeks also developed ideas about music that would prove controversial and influential for thousands of years. Plato believed that different musical modes, different scales and rhythmic patterns could influence human character in predictable ways. Some modes, he argued, inspired courage and virtue, while others promoted laziness, sensuality, or moral weakness. This theory led Plato to advocate for strict regulation of music in his ideal state. In his view, the wrong kinds of music could be as dangerous to social order as bad laws or corrupt leadership. Young people should be exposed only to musical modes that would encourage the development of virtuous character traits. This Greek synthesis of mathematics, philosophy, psychology, and artistic practice created the intellectual foundation for much of subsequent Western music theory. The concepts of scales, intervals, and harmonic relationships that the Greeks developed would influence musical development for thousands of years, shaping everything from medieval church music to modern jazz and classical composition.
If Greece gave music its philosophical foundation and mathematical precision, Rome gave it volume, organization, and imperial ambition. In the Roman world, music became a tool of state power, military efficiency, and public spectacle on a scale that dwarfed anything previous civilizations had achieved.
Roman music was fundamentally about function and force. Where the Greeks had seen music as a pathway to understanding cosmic harmony, the Romans saw it as a practical technology for organizing society, coordinating military operations, and demonstrating imperial power. This wasn't to say that Romans didn't appreciate musical beauty, they certainly did, but their approach to music was characteristically pragmatic and systematic. The most iconic symbols of Roman musical culture were the massive brass instruments that accompanied their legendary military machine. The cornu, a curved horn shaped like the letter G and often taller than the soldiers who carried it, wasn't designed for melody or artistic expression. It was built for command and control, its powerful blasts capable of signaling troop movements, battle charges, and retreat orders across the chaos and noise of ancient battlefields. Alongside the cornu, Roman armies employed the tuba, unrelated to the modern instrument of the same name, a straight trumpet that could cut through the sounds of combat with piercing clarity. Together, these instruments helped maintain the discipline and coordination that made Roman legions the most effective military force in the ancient world. Imagine the psychological impact of tens of thousands of Roman soldiers marching in perfect synchronization to the brassy, haunting calls of these ancient horns. This wasn't just military organization, it was psychological warfare designed to intimidate enemies and inspire confidence in Roman troops. The sound of Roman military music announced the presence of imperial power in ways that were both practically effective and symbolically overwhelming. But Rome's musical culture extended far beyond military applications. In temples throughout the empire, tibiae, double flutes, accompanied religious ceremonies with a sophistication that rivaled anything produced in Greece or Egypt. In the great arenas like the Colosseum, musical performances opened gladiatorial games with all the pageantry of modern sporting events. At elite banquets, lyres and the hydraulis, an early water-powered pipe organ, created sophisticated soundscapes for wealthy guests. Rome's approach to music reflected the empire's broader cultural strategy: absorption and amplification. Romans borrowed musical instruments, techniques, and traditions from every culture they conquered, then reworked these elements to serve Roman purposes and express Roman values. Greek musical theory was preserved and transmitted, but applied to distinctly Roman ends. Egyptian instruments were adopted and modified. Celtic and Germanic musical traditions were incorporated into the imperial synthesis. This cultural absorption created a musical ecosystem of remarkable diversity and complexity. Roman music became a living mosaic that combined African rhythms, Eastern melodies, Celtic harmonies, and Mediterranean instruments into something that was simultaneously cosmopolitan and distinctly Roman. However, unlike Greek philosophers, Roman intellectuals wrote relatively little about musical theory or the deeper meaning of musical experience. For Romans, music was something to be used and enjoyed rather than analyzed or systematized. This practical approach contributed to music's widespread integration into Roman daily life, but it also meant that Roman musical innovations were often technical and organizational rather than theoretical or philosophical. While Rome was organizing music for imperial purposes, civilizations in Asia were exploring entirely different approaches to musical meaning and spiritual development. In ancient India, music was understood not merely as an art form, but as a direct pathway to divine consciousness and cosmic understanding. Indian musical traditions, rooted in the Vedas, some of the oldest sacred texts in existence, began with chant rather than instrumental music. The Samaveda in particular consisted of hymns designed not just to be read, but to be sung, following intricate melodic patterns called saman that were believed to elevate consciousness and harmonize the universe itself. These weren't casual songs or entertainment pieces, they were spiritual technologies, carefully crafted sonic formulas designed to align human consciousness with cosmic forces. Every note, every interval, every rhythmic pattern carried specific meanings and was believed to produce predictable effects on the listener's spiritual state. As Indian civilization evolved, so did its musical instruments. The veena, an early stringed instrument, became closely associated with Saraswati, the goddess of knowledge, music, and the arts. The mridangam, a barrel-shaped drum, provided rhythmic foundation for sacred performances. But what made Indian music truly distinctive was its sophisticated theoretical framework. Every note, every rhythm was connected to ragas and talas, complex melodic and rhythmic frameworks that were believed to evoke specific emotions, correspond to particular times of day, and even influence weather patterns and cosmic cycles. Music wasn't entertainment or mere artistic expression. It was discipline, meditation, a systematic method for balancing inner energies and achieving contact with eternal truths. While India was organizing music for imperial purposes, civilizations in Asia were exploring entirely different approaches to musical meaning and spiritual development. In ancient China, music was equally sacred but also deeply political. The legendary Emperor Shun, one of China's mythical 5 emperors, was said to have brought harmony to his entire empire through the proper use of music. This wasn't metaphorical. Chinese philosophy, particularly Confucianism, held that correct musical practices literally created moral behavior and social order. The Chinese developed an elaborate theory of musical cosmology. Different instruments were designed to reflect cosmic balance and social hierarchy. The guqin, a 7-stringed zither, was played in solitude by scholars and sages seeking wisdom and virtue. Its soft, meditative tones were meant to cultivate introspection and moral refinement. The shang, a mouth-blown reed instrument with multiple pipes, symbolized unity through diversity, many individual pipes working together to create a single harmonic whole. The bianzhong, sets of bronze bells arranged in specific configurations, were used in royal courts to represent proper hierarchical relationships and ritual order. Chinese music was tuned to precise mathematical intervals that were believed to correspond to natural cycles and cosmic principles. Harmony in music meant harmony in society, which meant harmony between earth and heaven. The wrong notes could literally disrupt the balance of the universe. In both India and China, music was never separate from life. It was life itself, a mirror of cosmic order, a discipline for spiritual development, and a sacred pulse that connected individual consciousness to universal truths. While Rome used music to conquer territories and organize armies, the East used it to commune with the divine, understand natural law, and achieve transcendental states of consciousness.
From the ethereal bone flutes echoing through Ice Age caves to the shimmering strings of Mesopotamian harps, from Egyptian sistrums that awakened gods to Chinese zithers that calmed emperors, music has proven to be humanity's most enduring and universal form of expression. It has survived the rise and fall of empires, crossed every ocean, and spoken to every culture that has ever existed. But why has music endured when so many other human inventions have faded into historical obscurity? The answer lies in music's unique ability to speak directly to something we can't fully explain. The emotional and spiritual center of human consciousness that exists beyond language, beyond culture, beyond individual identity. Music comforts us when words fail. It warns us when danger approaches. It excites us when we need energy. It unites us when we feel isolated. It helps us mourn when we face loss. Think about it. What does a lullaby offer to a crying infant that mere words cannot provide? What does a funeral drum communicate when speech falls short of capturing grief? What does a national anthem stir in us before a battle or a sporting event that a simple speech could never achieve? Music operates at a level that bypasses rational thought and speaks directly to what we might call the soul. A melody from the Andes Mountains can move someone who has never been to South America. A drum rhythm from a Polynesian island might feel familiar to someone living in Scandinavia. It's not the specific notes or beats we recognize. It's the emotional content they carry, the human feelings they express and evoke. This universality makes music profoundly different from other forms of human communication. Languages divide us. Most people can only understand a few of the thousands of languages spoken on Earth. Visual art often requires cultural context to be fully appreciated. Religious practices can seem strange or meaningful depending on your background and beliefs.
But music transcends these barriers. It doesn't require translation. It doesn't need cultural explanation. You don't have to understand the history or context of a piece of music to feel its emotional impact. All you need are ears and a heart that listens. Music is also remarkably flexible and adaptable. It survives colonization by incorporating new elements while maintaining its essential character. It crosses oceans by taking on local flavors while preserving its core message. It evolves through war and revolution by expressing new emotions while staying connected to ancient roots. Consider how instruments have traveled across continents and been adapted by different cultures. The violin family, which developed in Italy, spread across Europe and eventually reached every corner of the world, taking on local characteristics while maintaining its fundamental voice. African rhythmic patterns crossed the Atlantic with enslaved peoples and eventually influenced everything from jazz to rock to hip-hop. Songs change languages, scales evolve, instruments are modified, but the essential human impulse to create and respond to organized sound remains constant. Whether it's a shepherd in the Himalayas playing a simple flute, a gospel choir in Alabama, or a symphony orchestra in Vienna, the basic human drive to express meaning through sound connects all these expressions. Throughout history, we've used music to define identity. Every tribe, nation, religion, and revolutionary movement has had its distinctive songs and sounds. Music helps us understand who we are by expressing what we value, what we fear, what we hope for, and what we believe. National anthems, religious hymns, work songs, and protest chants all serve this identity-forming function. But we've also used music to transcend identity, to collaborate across differences, and to connect with people who might otherwise seem foreign or strange. When musicians from different cultures come together, they often find they can communicate and create together even when they don't share a common spoken language. Music becomes a universal tongue that allows for collaboration across seemingly impossible barriers. Modern science is now confirming what ancient wisdom always understood intuitively. Music literally alters brainwaves, reduces stress hormones, and triggers the release of neurochemicals associated with pleasure, bonding, and transcendence. It activates memory centers in ways that can reach people with severe dementia when other forms of communication have become impossible. Alzheimer's patients who can no longer recognize their own families often remember and respond to melodies from their youth. Veterans suffering from PTSD find relief through music therapy when other treatments have failed. Premature babies in hospital incubators grow stronger and develop faster when exposed to appropriate musical stimulation. We've turned music into therapy for healing trauma and illness. We've used it as a form of protest against injustice and oppression. We've made it central to religious and spiritual practices across all traditions. We've built industries around it, creating economic systems that employ millions of people worldwide. In a world increasingly fractured by language barriers, political divisions, and cultural misunderstandings, music remains one of our most reliable methods for creating connection and shared experience. It doesn't solve all problems or eliminate all conflicts, but it provides a common ground where human beings can meet as fellow feeling creatures rather than as representatives of competing ideologies or interests.
As we reach the end of our long journey together tonight, from the brutal spectacles of ancient Rome to the covered wagons rolling across American prairies, from Ice Age caves where the first flutes sang, to concert halls where orchestras still play those same fundamental melodies, one truth emerges that connects all these stories: the power of human creativity to transform suffering into beauty, chaos into order, and isolation into connection. Music represents something essential about what it means to be human. It's our signature in sound.
a form of expression that traces back to our earliest ancestors and continues to evolve with each new generation. When those prehistoric humans first blew air through hollow bird bones, they weren't just making noise. They were declaring that survival wasn't enough, that existence needed beauty to make it meaningful. This same impulse drove the Maya to create elaborate musical ceremonies, the Romans to march to the sound of brass horns, and American pioneers to carry fiddles in their covered wagons, even when space was too precious to waste on non-essentials. Music wasn't optional for these people. It was necessary, as vital as food, shelter, or security. Think about what this means. Throughout all of human history, in every culture we know of, people have taken time and energy away from the immediate demands of survival to create and participate in musical experiences. They've carved instruments from precious materials, composed songs that took years to perfect, and gathered in groups to sing and play together, even when those gatherings involved risk or sacrifice. This isn't practical behavior in any obvious sense. Music doesn't provide calories, it doesn't offer protection from enemies or harsh weather, it doesn't produce tools or weapons or shelter, and yet every human society has treated music as essential, not optional. Why? Because music does something that nothing else can do. It makes the invisible visible, the inexpressible expressible, the individual universal. When we make music together, whether it's a few friends around a campfire or 100,000 people singing at a concert, we experience something that transcends our ordinary sense of separateness. The rhythm synchronizes our heartbeats. The melody aligns our breathing. The harmony blends our individual voices into something larger than any of us could create alone. For those moments, we stop being isolated individuals struggling alone and become part of something bigger, more connected, more meaningful. This is why music has survived every catastrophe that has befallen human civilization. Empires rise and fall, technologies become obsolete, languages disappear. But music adapts, evolves, and continues. It carries forward the essential human experiences: love, loss, joy, fear, hope, despair, in forms that speak across time and cultural boundaries. Modern neuroscience tells us that making music together is one of the most complex activities the human brain can perform. It requires coordination between multiple brain regions, synchronization with other people's rhythms and melodies, real-time adjustment to changing musical circumstances, and emotional expression that communicates meaning without words. And yet children do this naturally, instinctively, joyfully. They sing before they can speak in complete sentences. They dance before they can walk steadily. They respond to rhythm before they understand mathematics. Music isn't something we have to learn to do, it's something we have to learn not to do. Something that gets trained out of us by educational systems and social pressures that prioritize practical skills over creative ones. But the urge never completely disappears. Even people who claim they can't sing, can't play instruments, can't dance, they still respond to music. They still have songs that move them, rhythms that make them tap their feet, melodies that trigger powerful memories and emotions. This is our heritage as human beings. We are musical creatures living in a musical universe. The planets orbit in mathematical relationships that create cosmic harmonies. The human heart beats in rhythms that drums have imitated for thousands of years. Brain waves pulse in patterns that electronic music now explores. DNA follows structures that mirror musical compositions. We didn't impose music on the universe, we discovered it in the fabric of existence itself and learned to participate in its ongoing creation. Every song we sing, every instrument we play, every rhythm we dance to is our contribution to a cosmic symphony that began with the first sounds our ancestors made and will continue as long as human consciousness persists. No matter how far we advance in artificial intelligence, space exploration, or genetic engineering, music will remind us of something essential about what it means to be human. We are not merely biological machines optimized for survival and reproduction. We are creative beings, capable of transforming raw sound into meaning, individual voices into collective harmony, temporal moments into eternal beauty. As long as we draw breath, we will continue to make music. Because long before we had complex stories to tell, before we had technologies to build, before we had philosophies to debate, we had sound. And sound made us human. Music keeps us human. And through music, we remain connected to the deepest truths about who we are and why we exist.
And so, my dear friends, we come to the end of our extraordinary journey together. We've witnessed the darkest creativity of human imagination in Rome's theatrical punishments, walked alongside brave pioneers crossing an entire continent in search of new lives, and traced the golden thread of music that connects us to our most ancient ancestors and our deepest humanity. What strikes me most about all the stories we've shared tonight is how they reveal the full spectrum of what it means to be human. We've seen our species at its worst, devising punishments so cruel they seem to spring from nightmares, displacing entire peoples in the name of progress, turning suffering into entertainment for bloodthirsty crowds. But we've also seen humanity at its most admirable. Families risking everything for the chance to build better lives. Women showing incredible courage in the face of impossible hardship. People preserving and creating beauty even when survival itself was uncertain. The Romans who invented those horrific punishments were the same species that created magnificent architecture, sophisticated legal systems, and engineering marvels that still inspire us today. The Americans who drove native peoples from their ancestral lands were also the ones who built communities from scratch in hostile wilderness, created new forms of democratic government, and extended opportunities to people who had never had them before. This isn't to excuse the cruelties or minimize the tragedies. It's to recognize that human nature is complex, contradictory, and capable of both extraordinary creation and devastating destruction. Often these impulses exist within the same individuals, the same cultures, the same historical moments. Music, perhaps more than anything else, helps us understand this complexity. It gives voice to all of human experience, the beautiful and the terrible, the sacred and the profane, the individual and the universal. A funeral dirge can be as moving as a celebration song. A march can inspire either conquest or liberation. A lullaby can comfort a child in a palace or a refugee camp with equal tenderness. The bone flutes we talked about tonight were created by people living in one of the harshest environments humans have ever faced. Ice Age Europe was cold, dangerous, and unforgiving. Survival required every ounce of energy and attention. And yet these people took the time to create beauty, to make music, to express something beyond the immediate demands of staying alive. That impulse, the drive to create meaning and beauty even in the midst of hardship, is what I find most hopeful about our species. The Roman emperors who devised the most creative punishments also built the Pantheon. The American pioneers who participated in displacing native peoples also preserved and created folk music traditions that still enrich our culture today. We are not perfectible creatures. We will never eliminate suffering, injustice, or cruelty from human experience. But we are creative creatures, capable of transforming even our worst experiences into art, music, and stories that help others understand and cope with their own struggles. Tonight, as you prepare for sleep, you might find yourself humming a tune, or hearing music in the rhythm of rain on your window, or remembering a song that your parents sang to you when you were small.
If so, you're participating in the same human tradition that began in those Ice Age caves and continues wherever people gather to make sound together. You're part of an unbroken chain of musical experience that stretches back tens of thousands of years and forward into a future we can barely imagine. Every time you sing, dance, clap your hands, or simply tap your foot to a rhythm, you're adding your voice to the ongoing human symphony. The covered wagons have stopped rolling. The Roman amphitheaters have crumbled into ruins. The frontier has closed and been transformed into something else entirely. But the music continues. The human voice still sings. The rhythm still calls us to dance. The melody still has the power to move us to tears or lift us to joy. This is what survives. This is what endures. Not the empires or the technologies or the political systems, but the essential human capacity to create meaning through organized sound, to find beauty in the midst of chaos, to connect with others across all the barriers that seem to divide us. Thank you for taking this long journey with me tonight. Thank you for your curiosity, your patience, and your willingness to explore the full spectrum of what it means to be human. The dark and the light, the ancient and the eternal, the particular and the universal. If you've enjoyed our time together, please remember to subscribe to the channel and share these stories with others who might find them meaningful. History isn't just something that happened to other people in distant times. It's the ongoing human story that we're all still writing together. Until we meet again for our next adventure through the landscape of human experience, take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and remember that you carry within you the same creative spark that lit the first fires, carved the first flutes, and sang the first songs. Good night, my friends. May your dreams be filled with music.